Greetings, those of you who have joined us on the SAPES Policy Dialogue today. We're looking at the topic, what is the status of the economy in Zimbabwe, the facts and figures, and the political and social implications thereof. We have, before I introduce the speakers, just want to say that the backdrop to this session is rather the confusion and indeed sometimes mystery around the statistics on the Zimbabwean economy, the politicization thereof, the myths, even the downright lies about the nature of the economy. So much so that it's become imperative that we call upon leading economists like those we have today, Prosper Chitambara and General Joe, to dispel some of these myths, to let the people know, the public, fellow activists, understand the nature and content of the Zimbabwean economy. And in particular, also indicate the possible political and social implications of what appears, by any standards, to be an economy in dire straits. Our presenters today, Prosper Chitambara, one of our leading economists in Zimbabwe, who has been at the cutting edge of producing economic analysis over the last decade. So we're pleased that Prosper Chitambara has joined us hereby. General Joe from the Southern African Trust has been a regular participant on this forum, dealing in particular with the questions of debt and the impact on the poor and vulnerable in our society. We had invited, in fact, Ostalos Siziba had volunteered to be on this panel, but I hope our suspicions are not confirmed that maybe he has been prevailed upon not to participate, and if so, it is a pity that he has not had the courage to let us know, even a phone call. Nevertheless, we have the two very able economists to help us. I therefore call on Prosper Chitambara to give us an outline of the economy in Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much, Ibo. Good evening, as colleagues. Thank you for this opportunity to share with you some thoughts on the state of the economy, unpacking some of the numbers, as well as maybe possible implications of that state of affairs in terms of our economy. So I think it's prudent that I have a slide. In fact, I'm in Bulawayo where I was doing a presentation on the state of the economy. So probably I'll just take you through the slides that I shared with the employers just a few moments ago. So just give me a few minutes or a few seconds to just project or to share my screen. Then obviously I'll be speaking to those issues on the slides. Okay. All right, thank you. So I thought it prudent that we probably start by highlighting global macroeconomic, the state of the global macroeconomy and prospects, which is characterized currently by a number of uncertainties, which are underpinned by trade tensions, trade wars among the major economies, particularly the US and China. They still haven't agreed yet on a bilateral trade agreement. Then, of course, shifting policies, whether at fiscal policy, but also even at monetary policy. We are beginning to see, for example, in the US, there has been some resurgent inflationary pressures. Of course, it's not yet a major concern. The August numbers are showing that there's been an increase in the inflation numbers. Europe, on the other hand, it's improving. It's showing signs of improving growth, even though that growth is considered to be fragile. Then China is also battling deflationary headwinds. And in the emerging regions of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa, there's a projection of stronger growth momentum. Of course, the major challenge in those regions, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, has been the fact that even though growth has been happening, that growth has not had a very significant impact on poverty. So the number of poor sub-Saharan Africans actually continues to increase, and obviously that's actually a worrying trend. Then in terms of the projections for economic growth by the major multilateral financial institutions at global level, there's a slowdown that is anticipated by the IMF from 3.3% last year to 2.8% this year. The World Bank is projecting growth to remain stagnant or steady at 2.7%, while the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is expecting GDP growth at global level to moderate slightly from 3.2% last year to 3.1% this year. But one major issue affecting most countries, I would say, is the growing indebtedness. So this is total debt, including public debt, but also debt by businesses and debt by households. So we've seen a significant increase in the total debt stock at a global level to 323 trillion in 2024. So this debt that is actually owed by the governments, by the businesses, the private sector, including households, individuals. And we see a very significant jump since the genesis of the COVID-19 in 2020, from 226 trillion in 2020 to the current 323, or the estimated 323 trillion as at end of last year. And obviously, the huge debt burden is having a disproportionate brunt on the poorest, with massive crowding out impact or cutbacks on productivity enhancing and welfare enhancing sectors such as social protection, health, as well as education. So those sectors have been the worst affected. And most countries, in any case, especially in Africa, are actually in debt distress, which means that they are struggling to pay back the debt, including obviously Zimbabwe. But of course, we'll look at Zimbabwe in greater detail in the following slides. And a study that was done by the Norwegian Church Aid actually found out that for every dollar of revenue that accrues to governments, they're actually spending on average about 42 cents on debt repayment, which is actually significant. It actually means that the amount of monies that governments are spending on debt repayment in the developing world is actually far more than how much they actually spend, say, on health or even on education or on social protection. So that's a major challenge. So that's just an overview in terms of the global macroeconomic environment. Now let's look at the numbers locally. We'll also try to unpack those numbers. We'll use official numbers where possible, but we'll try to critique some of those numbers if need be. So Zimbabwe this year, of course, past economic growth rate, or rates rather, have not been fast enough, and they have not had a significant poverty reduction impact or even employment creating impact. So even when we look at our growth performance, say over the last 10 years, the economy has grown on average by about 2.5%, which is very, very insufficient to ensure that we attain the vision of the president of being an upper middle income economy by 2030. This year, we thank God for the rains, which resulted in a significant rebound in agriculture. So agriculture did relatively well, especially tobacco, the tobacco subsector. We set a new record in terms of production, and even the tobacco sold. We are also seeing improvements in terms of gold output. So the price of gold has also increased quite significantly. I think we reached a 40-year record, or probably a 50-year record, actually, a few years back, which obviously is a boon for gold production. So a lot of investors are actually seeking haven in gold. So that explains why the price of gold has actually been increasing. So for Zimbabwe, gold and tobacco, those are the mainstays in terms of foreign currency receipts, in terms of foreign currency inflows. Maize production hasn't done as well as we expected. And we're also seeing that farmers are also not willing to sell their maize. A number of farmers, rather, are not willing to sell their maize to GMB. I think there's still a lot of uncertainties. Farmers are holding on to their maize. Yeah, so Zimbabwe is actually importing maize as we speak because of some of those challenges. And in any case, a lot of farmers, we are seeing that a lot of farmers are also now migrating from maize production, which is controlled, to tobacco, because tobacco has been doing very well. And farmers that are doing tobacco are actually doing very, very well, because the prices are also very good. So that's one of the challenges. And I think because of that, we'll probably continue to experience a gap in terms of our maize production for the foreseeable future. So I would characterize our macroeconomic growth, our economic growth performance as being, number one, erratic. In other words, we've failed to sustain high growth rate over time. When you compare with countries, China, I always give the example of China. 2 years back, I went on a study visit to China. And China, one of the key success stories, or one of the key factors behind their success story, amazing success story, in a relatively short period of or space of time, has been the fact that they've been able to sustain high growth rate of not less than 10% per year from around 1978 up to just the time before COVID, around 2019. So the Chinese economy during that period has grown by on average 12% every year, and they've been able to sustain that high growth rate. And because of that, there has been massive impact, positive impact on poverty reduction. Growth has also been anemic. In other words, it's been rather weak. So at best, we have grown by, apart from the time of the inclusive government era, we've grown by around 7%, which is grossly inadequate, because the World Bank did a study, did some modeling, and they actually found out that for Zimbabwe to achieve the vision of being an upper middle income economy by 2030, our economy must grow by not less than 15% per annum from 2023 up to 2030. So far, we have not been able to attain that threshold of 15%. So that's a challenge. So we are the numbers actually show that we are likely not going to achieve that target, or that the vision. of being an upper middle income economy by 2030, unless something happens miraculously and the economy grows by maybe 20% next year or 30% next year and is able to sustain those numbers for the few years remaining until 2030. So because growth has been weak, it means the government has not been able to mobilize adequate resources to channel to critical sectors of our economy. So the reason why Zimbabwe is where it is, it's ultimately it's an investment problem. So there's a huge investment gap. There's a huge financing gap. So for a country to prosper, it must sustain investments in capital investments, and also so you have what is called physical capital, which is your roads, your airports, your dams, your electricity infrastructure, the hard infrastructure. Then we have social capital, which is your social protection, your health, your education. So those investments in those sectors are critical to sustain growth and ultimately to achieve sustainable development. Now, I'll show you the numbers for Zimbabwe. We have not been investing enough. In fact, one of the biggest problems we've had is that the bulk of our resources that we earn as a country are going towards non-productive recurrent spending. So obviously that weakens the productive capacity of the economy to grow sustainably. So in the past, it used to be about 90 cents for every dollar of revenue that we collect. We were actually spending about 90 cents on salaries for civil servants, living on less than about 10% to finance infrastructure. So because we've not been investing adequately and sufficiently in infrastructure over, I would say, over the last 20 years, we have huge infrastructure financing gap. In fact, the African Development Bank has estimated our financing gap just in terms of road infrastructure and electricity, the other infrastructure, at about $5 billion per annum. So we need to be investing an additional $5 billion per annum in the hard infrastructure for the next 10 years to close that huge financing gap that we have actually accumulated over time. So that's a major challenge. Of course, recently the ZimStat, that's the official statistics agency. So they've revised upwards. They've revised upwards. They've rebased in economics. They say to rebase our GDP numbers. So for our total GDP for 2023, for example, was actually revised to 44.5 billion from the original 35.2 billion. So according to ZimStat, the revision reflects or takes into account the growing informal economy. So Zimbabwe is one of the biggest informal economies actually in the world. In fact, according to statistics from the National Monetary Fund, Zimbabwe is the second highest levels of informality. And in fact, the economic census by ZimStat actually showed that 76.1% of total business establishments in Zimbabwe are informal businesses. And the last labor force survey by ZimStat, so it's the Q3 2024 labor force survey, actually revealed that 85.5% of total employment in Zimbabwe is actually informal. So most of our employment is actually informal employment, and obviously it creates a lot of challenges, not only for the people that are eking out a living in that economy or in that sector, but also even for government in terms of domestic resource mobilization, but also even in terms of enhancing the effectiveness of macroeconomic policies, of policies. Because policies become sterile or less effective when there are high levels of informality. Let me just give you an example. Say, if the government were to decide tomorrow that they're going back to the monocurrency regime, it's just an example. I'm not saying that that's going to happen. It may or may not happen. It will be difficult for that policy to be very effective. Why? Because it will only be targeting about 20% of the total economy, and the 80% which is not regulated may still continue to use the USD. So it's just an example. So if we decide to de-dollarize, it means a significant proportion or segment of our economy may still remain dollarized. Why? Because they're outside the purview of government regulations. So I'm just trying to buttress the point that as long as we have high levels of informality, our policies are not as effective, because it means the huge segment of the economy is not directly under the control of government. So government actually loses control of the economy the higher the levels of informality. But also, in addressing that problem, you then have to look at undertake a diagnostics analysis to determine the causes of that high levels of informality. Because the major cause has been the fact that growth has not been associated with jobs, but also our economy has experienced deindustrialization. So one of the key problems facing our economy is that we have a huge competitiveness gap, and it's largely being caused by the high cost of doing business. So it's difficult for Zimbabwean businesses, even within the context now of the African Continental Free Trade Area, it's difficult for Zimbabwean businesses to sustainably compete with, say, businesses from Zambia or from Botswana or from South Africa. Why? Because of that gap in competitiveness. So it essentially means, in layman's terms, that we don't produce enough, which explains why we have to import. But even the little that we produce locally, we are producing it at a very, very high cost of doing business. Look at the cost of finance in Zimbabwe. It's one of the highest, actually, in the continent. If you are borrowing money, say, in USD, you're probably borrowing, depending on your risk profile, you probably borrow money at around 18%, 20%, which is on the very, very high side. So for businesses, it becomes very difficult to borrow money for working capital purposes. So that increases the costs. But also utilities in general, our rentals, our fuel is the third most expensive fuel, and also because of outages, businesses and households are relying on, for businesses, they have to rely on generators, or I know a number of businesses have also invested in solar, but of course it requires a bit of money, so that increases the costs. But if you are doing business running a generator, that's not sustainable. So you lose actually competitiveness. Look at the state of our railway network. So the cheapest way of moving goods in a country is through railway. So when your railway is not functional, it affects the cost of doing business. It affects the competitiveness of our economy. So I would say the two biggest enablers for doing business in any economy are, number one, your energy. You need energy, a reliable supply of energy. But number two, you also need the railway network, transport and logistics. Transport is very critical. So according to the World Bank, those are the two biggest enablers of doing business. That's why I was impressed by Ethiopia when they launched their grant, Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is the biggest hydroelectric project or investment on the African continent. That's going to boost the Ethiopian economy. In fact, they're already calling Ethiopia the Dubai of Africa. And what's very impressive and inspirational about that investment is that it was done using Ethiopian resources. They didn't borrow any money from the World Bank, from America, from anywhere. So they just mobilized their domestic resources, but also leveraging the diaspora. So Ethiopia has been very successful in terms of the diaspora engagement program, and I'm sure it's an area that Zimbabwe also can learn a lot or lessons. So one of the biggest challenges in Zimbabwe is the high levels of poverty. So it's currently estimated that about 40% of Zimbabweans are living in extreme poverty. And the target for this year under NDS 1 was to reduce the number of Zimbabweans living in poverty to below 10%, or at least 10%, at most rather 10%. I'm not sure whether that's going to be attainable, but the issue of poverty, it's a major challenge. And it's largely because most Zimbabweans don't have a formal job or a decent jobs. So that's one of the key drivers of poverty. Most people are just eking out a living in the informal economy, where there are lots of decent work deficits. There is no social security. So that then creates problems in terms of addressing the high levels of poverty. But also the other problem is high levels of income inequality. In fact, a study that was done by ZimStat, that was done during the time of COVID, so it's a bit dated, it actually revealed that the richest 10% of Zimbabweans consume 40% of the total consumption in Zimbabwe. So the richest 10% are consuming 40%, which means the rest, the 90%, are consuming the 60%. So that goes to show the extent of inequality in Zimbabwe. And we think that the situation could actually have worsened. The inequality situation could actually have worsened. And anecdotal evidence actually shows that. So there are three factors, in my view, that are critical. So this is actually based on stylized facts for sustained growth and development. The first one is stability. So Zimbabwe, we've struggled with macroeconomic stability for the longest of times. I think it's been largely on account of the lack of discipline, both fiscal discipline and monetary discipline, of course, which is what the government is now trying to address. Excess creation of money supply, excess growth in money supply, which ends up chasing too few goods, thereby creating inflationary pressures, but also chasing too few US dollars, causing the exchange rate, therefore, to depreciate. So we need a low and stable inflationary environment. So Zimbabwe, because of the chronic high inflation and the hyperinflation that we've experienced, economic agents have actually lost confidence, trust and confidence in the local currency, which explains why we experienced this, what we call currency substitution, or the dollarization. So it was actually a market response to the hyperinflation. And it takes a bit of time for economic agents for there to be a restoration of confidence and trust in a currency once an economy has experienced a dollarization. So, of course, government is working with a target of de-dollarizing or adopting a monocurrency by 2030. But of course, there are a number of risks, one of which is what I've already mentioned around the high levels of informality, which may make it not very effective to say that you are dollarized, whilst the greater segment of the population of the economy may still remain dollarized. So I'll show you the numbers, the inflation numbers just shortly. We have the figures, the latest numbers. Then we'll try to interpret those numbers. But another key challenge that we faced in Zimbabwe, of course, it's not just a Zimbabwean problem. Most countries in Africa have experienced institutional decay. The role of institutions are very critical, whether they're economic institutions. So by economic institutions, I'm referring to things like parastatals, state-owned enterprises, property rights, the tax environment, the doing business environment. So those are the key economic institutions. Then the political institutions, obviously. I'm not going to mention the parliament, the judiciary. So in most countries, in Africa, I'll give a good example. South Africa has experienced the state capture, where few individuals are able to capture a state for personal aggrandizement. So South Africa, that state capture commission, which actually found out that one family had managed to capture the whole state. So there's a book written by a scholar, two scholars rather, from one of them is at MIT. It's called Why Nations Fail. So the key argument in that book basically is that nations fail because the institutions that are supposed to contribute to development are either non-existent, or if they're existent, they've been captured by fewer individuals, or in most cases, may be politically exposed. So that's basically the argument in that book, and it's really based on case studies especially from African countries. That's why I'm generalizing this to Africa. So it's a problem, and because of weak institutions, it means corruption actually thrives. And the African Development Bank did a study which actually found out that for a country like Zimbabwe, corruption imposes a 20% premium on doing business. In other words, corruption is an indirect tax on business. So those are actually huge numbers. So the issue of institutions is critical. We need transparent, accountable. We need to continue to implement institutional reforms that are aimed at ensuring that we address corruption. But of course, let me also highlight that anti-corruption reforms by their nature are not easy to implement. In fact, when you look at the number of countries that have attempted to do that, even the champions of that process can then become casualties along the way, because there are strong vested interests that will begin to fight once you intend to address problems around corruption the world over. We've seen it happening. That it's not easy. It can happen, actually. It has happened, but it's very, very difficult to implement anti-corruption or institutional reforms in general. Why? Because they threaten certain vested interests. Infrastructure is very critical. No economy can prosper without adequate infrastructure. And like I said, the biggest enablers to doing business in any economy are energy and the railway or transport. So we need to get those. So those three factors, in my view, are what I would call the critical success factors for sustained growth and development in any economy. Of course, government did a midterm review of the NDS1, which it was not an independent review, rather. It was done by the OPC. Of course, it identified a number of challenges that need to be addressed, especially around the health issues, the social sectors. So probably the government will try to address those in the. We understand government is working on the NDS2. Which will succeed the NDS1, so to be implemented from 2026 until 2030. I think I've already mentioned some of these structural binding constraints: the power outage issues, the high taxes, the informality, limited access to the high cost of credit. Now, when you look at our doing business, our productivity, or rather, it's called capacity utilization of the industrial sector. The numbers are still on the lower side. We're on the lower side, 53.2%. That's not good enough. In fact, there's actually been a decline. So those are the latest numbers that we actually have in terms of capacity utilization within the manufacturing sector. So you can see that our manufacturing sector is not operating optimally. 53%. That's a poor mark in my view. We need to at least be hovering in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, not less than 70%. But of course, it's a journey that we hope we will be able to successfully traverse and increase our capacity utilization. But also the contribution of the manufacturing sector to GDP is actually declined from about 15% to 9%, which actually shows that the country is actually experienced deindustrialization and consequently informalization. So the deindustrialization has also been one of the key drivers of the informalization. The doing business environment still remains challenging. So we have seen the Minister of Finance, they're now implementing the ease of doing business reforms on a sector by sector basis. I think my comment there is that it's talking to business people. What people want to see is a comprehensive and holistic ease of doing business reforms that are also targeting the tax regime. But when you talk to business people, they are lamenting the high levels of taxes. So it's not. So what Mthuli is currently doing, or what the Minister of Finance rather, they're currently doing is to focus on regulatory fees, licensing fees. So they're trying to reduce those, which is positive. But we need to also address the issues of tax, the direct taxes. I think that's the key story, even from the meeting that I had with the business people earlier today, that they also want to see our taxes actually being reviewed downwards. But what happens is that when you review your taxes downwards, number one, you're actually reducing the cost of compliance for informal businesses to formalize or to comply voluntarily. So by doing that, you're actually expanding the tax base. But number two, you're also leaving economic agents with more disposable incomes. And that can now then drive aggregate demand in the economy, which will actually imply that government actually ends up getting more revenues. And we've seen this in countries like Ireland, for example. Ireland in the early 2000s, they actually reduced their taxes, their corporate tax, for example, I think to around 10%. So they adopted a uniform and low and uniform tax regime of around 10%. And within 2 years, the Irish economy was actually growing by around 20%. Why? Because they were actually able to attract even more foreign direct investment inflows into Ireland, which resulted in job creation. But also, even the local businesses also thrived, and the government actually benefited more through greater domestic resource mobilization. So I'm a believer and a proponent of low taxes. In fact, we've had an engagement with the Minister of Finance. But my view is that I don't think we are likely going to see major changes in terms of our tax based on what I got from the minister. I don't think we are likely going to see major changes in terms of our tax regime. For example, one area that we were advocating for was the scrapping of the IMTT, which is affecting formal sector financial intermediation. But there's no commitment, in my view, to really scrap that. So I think the tax regime will probably remain as it is, in my view. And of course, a lot of businesses are being affected quite adversely by that. When you look at our FDI inflows numbers, so last year, according to UNCTAD, we attracted $597 million worth of foreign direct investment inflows, down from 635 million in 2023. When you compare with countries in the region, Zambia, our regional competitors, Zambia attracted about 1.2 billion, while South Africa attracted about $2.5 billion worth of FDI inflows. So I think those numbers are pointing to a very challenging doing business environment, which government is admitted that the environment is challenging, and they are trying to address those challenges. But the recommendation there is that we need to make those reforms more comprehensive, and not just focus on licensing fees and regulations, but also address the elephant in the room, which is the tax issue. And in fact, empirical evidence has shown that the higher the levels of taxes, the higher the levels of informality. So there's a direct relationship between high taxes and informality. And so the lower the taxes, the tax burden, the lower the levels of informality, which also then increases government resources, government revenues, but ultimately through expanding the tax base. So you can see the trends in FDI inflows for Zimbabwe. We've improved actually. Was at one time we were at 194. That's the COVID-19. But 597 again, that's not good enough in my view. I think we need to be doing at least $1 billion, not less than $1 billion. But of course, it can only happen if we address the structural binding constraints affecting businesses. So just to demonstrate how taxes are affecting businesses, the Chamber of Mines actually did a study where they were calculating the effective tax rate for the mining sector in Zimbabwe, and they came up with a figure of 69% for 2024. So these are numbers from the Chamber of Mines. Then they compared with Zambia. So Zambia, the effective tax rate in the mining sector for Zambia, 60%. The DRC, 61%, Ghana, 56%, South Africa, 44%. So it means our miners are not as competitive. Why? Because of the weight or the burden of those taxes. I think, well, I'll try to summarize some of the issues. Then if there's time, I can always come back so that I probably allow Janet to also come on board. So I'll just finalize in the next 5 minutes, but I'll always come back because there's still a lot to say. That table there, colleagues, is just a summary of our performance, macroeconomic performance over from 2010 to 2025. Looking at those macroeconomic aggregates or variables, the GDP, then you juxtapose with the targets under NDS 1, then the inflation. So inflation has been one of our biggest macroeconomic challenges, inflation. So for a long time, Zimbabwe had the unenviable record of having the highest inflation rate on the African continent. And it don't augur well for investments, not just foreign investments, but also local investment. But one of the key indicators that an investor looks at before investing, whether it's a local investor or a foreign investor, is inflation. Because what inflation does is that it erodes your profit. It erodes your real incomes. Inflation erodes real incomes. So no investor wants to invest in an environment that is highly inflationary. Inflation also creates a lot of uncertainties within the macroeconomy. Thereby it erodes confidence, whether it's consumer confidence, household confidence, investor confidence, business confidence. And ultimately, inflation is actually a tax on doing business, but it's also a tax on consumers, on households. So inflation is not good at all. But colleagues, where we are not doing well, the point that I raised earlier on, look at our investment to GDP numbers and our savings to GDP numbers. For savings, for example, at some point we're actually in negative territory, which means, which indicates a massive de-saving culture and a highly consumption orientation, high consumption orientation. So we need to, for saving to GDP, we need to achieve at least 25% of GDP. In other words, for every dollar of income that we earn, or for every dollar of output that we produce, we must save at least 25 cents as a country. And for every dollar that we produce, that we earn as a country, we must invest at least 25 cents. When you look at China, in China, for every dollar of income that they earn at national level, they save around 40 cents and they invest around 35 cents. So their saving to GDP ratio is around 40%. Their investment to GDP ratio is around 35%, which explains why they've been able to develop. Why? Because development at the end of the day is about investing in physical capital, but also investing in social capital. You're investing in your citizens. You are enhancing the productivity and the well-being of your economy and of your citizens by investing in the sectors that enhance their well-being and productivity. That's your health care, your social protection, your water and sanitation, your electricity. So those are the sectors that will ultimately determine whether a country actually develops or not. So a country can actually grow economically without necessarily developing. Why? Because it means that the country is not using the resources that are being generated to invest in the sectors that enhance the welfare and the well-being and the productivity of the citizens. So we often say in health economics that a healthy nation for example, is a prosperous or is a wealthy nation. Why? Because a healthy nation is more productive, and productivity is one of the biggest drivers of growth in the neoclassical framework, economic model. Even the heterodox model also highlights that productivity is critical for underpinning growth and development. Maybe I'm proposing that I end there now. I'll still come back, probably to allow Janet to also come on board. Then I can always come back because I'm seeing the time. I've talked for almost 45 minutes.
No, it's been very useful, Prosper. It's been very, very useful. That's why I gave you a free rein deliberately, because I thought this was a very useful exercise, even for the record. As you know, we are on YouTube, and therefore this discussion will be on record.
Yeah.
And I have a number of questions, but I have to defer those questions because Ostalos has joined us and is having a problem with his network. So I'll have to ask him to come in now. Ostalos, welcome. Come in. This is one of our emergent, ascendant political factors in our country, Ostalos Siziba. Are you able to join us now? You are muted. You are muted. Ostalos. David, can you help?
Can you hear me, Prof?
Now we can hear you now, yes. Siyabonga. I mean, I hope you're able to hear most of what Prosper Chitambara had to say. He has given us a very beautiful outline of the economy, a lot of food for thought, and in discussion time we'll be coming back to him. Any luck coming in now? Any luck? Janet, be on standby in case we have problems with Ostalos' network.
Now, Prof.
Okay? We can see you now.
Yes, I can hear you loud and
okay, all right.
Should I? Yeah.
No,
thank you very much, Prof, for inviting me in this very important discussion, and greetings to my fellow panelists and listeners. I think that my brief contribution is going to be centered on the social implications. I think that Doc has done justice in terms of bringing us into the quantitative and, of course, to a great extent, again, the qualitative implications of the economic situation right now. Using data of what different government institutions have produced. I think that my submission is centered fundamentally on that the crisis in the economy is centered, in my view, on two things: the quest for accountability and equity. So two things are very critical in the challenges that the economy of our country faces. So to me, it's the question of accountability and the question of equity. The growth that the Ministry of Finance has been publishing, the so-called celebrations on the character of the economy, is based on what we call ruthless economic growth without equity. So for me, it places a huge challenge on the crisis that we face in our country, because the economic challenges that we face, we look at it in terms of their impact to ordinary men and women in our country. So I'll look at, for example, the first thing is on the tax crisis. Doc raised very fundamental issues that it is not possible to tax our country out of the crisis. It is clear that the Minister of Finance believes that the solution is going to be continuing to burden ordinary people with more tax. There was a celebration, of course, when the ministry announced a part of the changes on the tax regime in our country. But what anyone would have expected, for me as an ordinary citizen and as a researcher, is that there was going to be scrapping of the 2% transaction tax, because that places a huge premium, not just to the ease of doing business, but for average ordinary Zimbabweans as they transact on their day to day. So the first challenge that we note on the economy is the issue of taxation, the issue of tax injustice in our country. And this also comes in that the burden of taxation is always placed on the ordinary people. It's important to look at this political economy analysis of the tax in our country, that the burden of taxation is on ordinary people. This happened at the same time when there are companies that are being given tax break. So, for example, Way getting tax break in the Great Dyke. So, the burden of taxation on the ordinary people. So, the lack of fair distribution of the burden of taxation to ordinary people. Secondly, the fact that all this high taxation is channeled towards one, expenditure, and secondly towards trying to pay our odious debt with the Paris Club of Lenders, the IMF, and the World Bank. So that places huge challenge, because the taxation that we get then does not go to social services, does not go to health, does not go to support education, but it goes primarily to go back to resolve the our debt problem. Secondly, on the economy is the question of the debt crisis. Our country is in debt distress, fundamentally because, in my respectful view, our inability to commit to the debt resolution processes. And I'll give reference to the Chisano-led process. It places a burden in our country, because the challenge of debt is not just the negotiation process, the renegotiation process that collapsed on the basis of the political challenges in the country, because you cannot divorce the challenges that are economic from the challenges that are political. So the collapse of the Chisano-led process was primarily because of our inability to resolve the political questions in the country. But then there's a second element to the debt question, which is the issue of procedure and the illegality associated with the debt problems in our country. Firstly, there's a huge belief that the debt in the country is understated. But secondly, is the element that the debt question that we face in our country, you look at the fact that it happens, most of the domestic debt that we're accruing at the present moment happens, and this has been put forward by the Auditor General's report. The debt that has been accrued domestically has been done without parliamentary approval. So the fact that Mthuli Ncube announces that an extra millions of dollars were accrued in the Mbuzi interchange without parliamentary approval. But this debt goes again to be burdened to the ordinary people. So the issue of illegality, the issue of the fact that all these things happen without parliamentary approval. But secondly, it happens contravening the provisions of the Public Management Act and the provisions of the Constitution read together. So that places a huge problem on our economy, because of our failure to resolve both the domestic debt question and, of course, the external debt, which has gone far behind above what is constitutionally mandated. Thirdly is on the crisis of the economy is corruption. Corruption places a huge premium on our economy. Our economy is in distress. Our economy is highly informalized. But if you see that our country loses more than 2 billion US dollars on illicit $1.2 billion on illicit outflow of gold alone. So we've not talked about platinum. We've not talked about diamonds, which government itself, the previous regime, said that a whooping more than 14 billion had been lost on diamonds revenue alone. But we're looking at the present data shows that the leakages on the economy, corruption places a huge premium on the economy and contributes to part of the challenge that we face as a country. But again, on corruption is also pinned directly to the collapse of institutions in our country. Both the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission and the Financial Intelligence Unit lack the prosecuting powers because of political interference, thanks to executive tyranny in our country. So corruption places a huge premium in our country, and is very much responsible in our characterization of the economy as the economy in distress. The economy in distress. Fourthly, the challenge of informalization of our economy. Our economy is highly informalized, Prof, and fellow listeners. But the government, on one hand, the Ministry of Finance acknowledges in its midterm review that the economy is highly informalized. The major contribution of mines and revenue from the mineral sector is from the informal sector. You talk about artisanal miners. They are the major contributors to the revenue in the mining sector. But when the Ministry of Finance acknowledges that our economy is highly informalized, the Ministry of Local Government, in the same vein, then says that we are banning the informal sector, whereas the government ought to be looking at how do we, it is important, of course, to look at the question of how do we formalize, how does government get revenue from the informal sector without necessarily saying we are banning vendors and we making sure that we destroy the informal, which the same government through its Ministry of Finance acknowledges that the economy is highly informalized. Lastly is the question of priorities. The ministry revealed that the Office of the President and Cabinet, OPC, is spent over 80% of its budget allocation. If you look at the amount of money that the Ministry of the OPC has spent, you'll be forced to conclude that the OPC was getting 1.2 million US dollars a day. If you calculate the numbers of amount of money that it has spent in terms of its budget allocation. But compare that to the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education. The Ministry of Health is said to have been allocated about 80%, 8% of its allocation, and the Ministry of Education again in the same vein. So I'm saying this to show the attitude and prioritization of government, to show where the government intends to spend. And this places a huge premium on the government, which is why I talked about the issue of equity. How do you have growth that does not translate to provision of jobs? So it's a jobless growth. It's a ruthless growth, because it's a growth quantitatively in terms of numbers, but that does not reflect in terms of the quality of life for ordinary average Zimbabwean, because ZimStats show that not just informalization, but also shows the percentage of people living below the poverty datum line. So all this shows that the growth that has been highly celebrated does not reflect on the quality of life for ordinary Zimbabwean, making us to conclude without doubt that our economy is in distress, that there are lack of priorities in terms of how we intend to spend our money, and secondly, how we intend to lock the leakages on the economy. So I think that for me is those will be my contribution, Prof. and fellow listeners, that the key question is about accountability, is about equity, and that our economy is highly in a distress. And the solutions to the economy, as we've always argued, that it is not possible to liberalize the economy without liberalizing politics. So at the end of the day, it is born out of the fact that the social contract in the country has collapsed. There is trust deficit. The relationship between those who govern and those that are being governed in our country long collapsed because of the vicious cycles of disputed elections in our country, the political problems. So it is not possible to analyze the economic challenges in our country without looking at the political questions that are facing our country. I know that today we are specifically looking at the economy, but it is important to stress that the economy cannot be divorced from the political questions in our country. I thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. I was saying that Ostalos' wonderful presentation. It was precisely what we wanted to hear from you. The political and social implications of the economy that is in dire straits. And indeed, I agree with you. The solution is politics. The restoration of social contract, restoration of trust, and an end to disputed elections. You have, I hope you are still there after Janet presents, because we'd like to have a video discussion among the three of you about the very pertinent issues that both you and Chitambara have raised. Let me move to Janet quickly, and then Janet, please feel at liberty to make your presentation. We have enough time. Last but not least, Janet.
I hope so. Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you for inviting me to this very important conversation. And thank you, Dr. Chitambara, for really laying the statistics and the figures bare. And I will not have to belabor much on the quantitative figures, because I'm sure you really covered a lot of ground around the quantitative figures and stats that we have, and that we have to consider when we look at the economy and the journey that we're traversing towards being an upper middle income country. And Ostalos, for I think starting to dig into the political economy of what probably those figures mean, and where we are. And I'm sure you have really laid that ground as well. I will refer to some of the figures and try and interrogate them and look at where we are and whether this vision 2030 in terms of being an upper middle income country is achievable, one. But the second thing is that where we want to go, and if it is, how do we get there? I'm sure we suffer a deficit of consensus at a national level in terms of where really we want to go and what are the fundamental issues that we have to focus on. Most of the times it seems like it's directives, it's government visions that don't have that public consensus with the people. But as I was listening to the fellow panelists, but also what the government has been pronouncing, the first issue for me is around the trade tensions that Dr. Chitambara has already referred to. And from where I am sitting and where we are as a country, what it means and what it has meant is that it shrinks our economy, which really depends on imports, with a very shaky balance of trade, if I may use that economic term. We do not trade that much. And colleagues have shared in terms of the leakages, the illicit financial flows, the capital flight, and the lack of investment that we are currently under, or that we have suffered for decades now, because of the context that we have. Of course, it could be high taxation, though we will caution that we also don't want the race to the bottom. It could be as well corruption, which raises the premium of investment in Zimbabwe and the like. So that shaky and lack of balance of trade for us and reliance on imports is a big issue, particularly when we then put this in the tensions globally that have been caused by the geopolitics and the trade wars, if I may put it that way. Then we have the high debt, which is an elephant in the room for years now. I think probably the past 3 decades, we have been talking about a debt resolution, particularly dealing with the arrears that have made it very difficult for us, probably one, to get concessionary loans, for us really being a high-risk country in terms of then investments and all. And the failure of that resolution really points to the political economy of the dialogue processes that we've been holding or that have been championed in the country. We need to really look at it and say, why is it that we have failed to come up with a national dialogue that really holds water and that can point towards a resolution of our economic or political and social crisis, or the multiple crises that we are facing. And maybe I'll go back to the issue of lack of consensus. One, in terms of what's the national question, in terms of what are the fundamental issues that we need to deal with, and that space still needs to be created or carved. We have the issues around the mineral resource leakages and the misgovernance that colleagues have already pointed to, and I won't really go much into it, but I wanted to also then highlight the highly informalized employment that we have, and Dr. Chitambara has already pointed to the ZimStats the figures of about 76%, the rebasing of our economy, and we sit here and ask ourselves, if we're going to be an upper middle income country, highly informalized as we are, what does it mean? Let's unpack who are in that informal sector, or who are the informal workers that we are talking about. And these are the youths, these are the women, who constitute probably about 60% of that 76% that we are talking about. So what it means is they are in an unregulated, they are in an unsupported, in an criminalized, if I may also use that word, sector, but subsidizing and anchoring actually the economy that we're talking about, that we would want to see getting to being an upper middle income country by 2030. Gift has spoken to the GDP growth. Dr. Chambara has spoken to the same. But we need to juxtapose that with the increasing poverty levels and the inequalities that they have spoken about. How insecure in terms of food the population still remains very insecure. Probably over 5 million people are always estimated to be food insecure. What does that mean when we are moving towards being an upper middle income country, when we are facing hunger and starvation and the insecurity that will undermine one livelihoods, lives themselves, basic necessities as well. So this really is a big issue and conversation that we need to have, and it's also tied to the public spending, which is a critical issue if we are going to address the challenges that most upper middle income economies face of inequalities and poverty. And we know if we look probably at the current budget, our national budget, only 8% to health, 12% to education, really falling short in terms of some of the agreements and protocols that we have signed to. And the lack of public infrastructure that is well resourced really is a question that we need to ask ourselves, and how we have managed and survived, even when the government is moving towards this Agenda 2030 of being an upper middle income country. I was also thinking in terms of how the diaspora has continued. I think we have shared in different spaces, in different dialogues here in this space around the diaspora and their remittances, and how they have continued to anchor and sustain this economy, which is, for me, a critical issue and conversation we still need to have in terms of what does it mean? How do we have those remittances have a voice? We have spoken about human development, which is voiceless, which is one other component that I can add to this. So it is voiceless locally, it is voiceless for our diasporans who have continued to sustain this economy amidst that limited domestic resource mobilization capacity, or the shrinking fiscal space, if we may use that word as well, locally. So we have to, while we continue to hear about this middle income future for Zimbabwe, I think the most important thing is for us to step outside, to go on the streets, to go in the rural areas, to go in universities, in colleges, in hospitals, in clinics, and see for ourselves if the economic growth that we're talking about is really transformative and transforming the lives on the ground, particularly of those that are already marginalized by the structures that have already been espoused by my fellow panelists. What we see is really survival, which is a hazard, and I think quite dangerous for us to move towards being an upper income middle country or economy when we have the majority of the population always in survival mode. We see families, we see the diaspora improvising safety nets to ensure that children are in school, to ensure that families or those that are sick are getting help, because the public infrastructure that should sustain and move us, and we have heard about the infrastructure gap or funding gap that we have. So with it collapsed and not invested in enough, we really have a danger of actually leaving many behind. If I may borrow from Dr. Kanyenze's book, I think there are many that are going to be left out when we look at the pillars that should support the growth, the social pillars that should support the growth. And I've referred to these, the energy blackouts that we have heard about, the schools that are really running on fumes, hospitals that are short of basics. It brings us to that Human Development Report of 1996, once again, long time ago, where we have to be asking ourselves whether we're pushing for the jobless, voiceless, ruthless, futureless. Now it's youthless, it's femaleless. It doesn't have the people at the center. And the question is, how do we demarginalize? How do we demarginalize those people that have been marginalized by the current politics that we have, and put them at the center and have them build the consensus for the Zimbabwe that they want, for the kind of economy that they want, for social justice, for economic justice, but also for that voice. Because if we don't address those, the quality of our growth will not reduce poverty, will not reduce the inequalities, will not lead us to sustainability, even the achievement of the sustainable development goals that we are looking forward to actually achieving, together with this being an upper middle income country. We did at the trust a scoping study around the care work, the burden of care work, and I want to also put it here because it is a critical factor for Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was one of the countries that we were looking at, and how women, how youth, how girls have carried that burden and subsidized the government to the point of, I think it's more like the philanthropy, if I may put it that way, that has sustained this economy. And we need to ask ourselves and say, where or how then do we build quality economic growth? Quality economic growth that looks at the climate change, for example, impacts. How have droughts, floods meant for those that we have said are on the margins, so that we demarginalize those narratives, those conversations, and bring them to challenge the government narratives around growth. Because we know that when there are droughts, when there are floods, who are the most impacted, for example, in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of water, in terms of firewood and all. We need to look at it as well from the natural resource governance perspective, the mining that we're talking about, to be specific, how it has decentered and displaced people. And what does that mean in terms of living a displaced life? Displaced in terms of literal displacements that we have witnessed in the past, but also displacement from opportunities, access to opportunities. And we need to look at that natural resource governance extractive sector and the models that have been used and how they have displaced people literally, how they have displaced people in terms of ways of living and access to opportunities, and how corruption, mismanagement, lack of accountability, rent-seeking behavior by the state, and all that have actually destabilized what the macroeconomic fundamentals that Dr. Chitambara has already spoken to. I would say that we need to address, of course, the structural issues. We need to address the issues around our institutions. We need to look at our models, our economic models, our social models themselves, in terms of how are they providing social security, safety nets for those that are marginalized and excluded, for example. And this is not an easy task for us to get to being that equal society, or to take from gift the issues around equity, where there is austerity, for example. How do we, where there is shrinking social spending, and I've shared some of the figures around health, education. Maybe we can even compare that with other ministries that receive government funding, and see that these are actually deprioritized. And this deprioritization is at our national level, but it is also escalated to global level. Zimbabwe used to depend so much on development partners for its health, for its education, for it to function. So now, with the deprioritization of our issues, are we really going to achieve being an upper middle income country? One, that is if we desire to actually be one, before we address all the other fundamentals that we've spoken about. So that is one of the key challenges. Then the extractive politics that we've spoken about, where rents are locked with the elites. We don't see the creation of jobs. We don't see social security being extended to the informal sector. We don't see financing of that informal sector. be it in the agriculture, be it in the mining, in the many other economic sectors that we have. Prof, I'll just end with probably just some reminders in terms of the reality check that we need in terms of being an upper middle income country vis-a-vis a collapsed economy, or that economy in dire straits, as you have said, and what possibilities are there for us to begin to grow from this year at a 20% rate that have already been shared until we get to 2030. And given how the weak institutions, our porous borders, controls, our politics and the political economy that we have, this reality check is what we have to ask ourselves about. We need to ask the citizen question: women, youth, people with disabilities, the communities that are displaced, they have a question in terms of the sort of how all the development that we have had translate into their lived realities. I think we've celebrated before even surpluses in terms of our budgets, but the outcry and the question, or the woman question, the youth question, the citizen question was surplus when we don't have access to basics. What does that mean? So we need to ask ourselves that issue. And a reminder around the structural drivers, austerity, the elite rent capture, which we don't have to hide from. We need to face it. We need to challenge it. We need to ask ourselves how our lack of probably voice will continue to have this continue. And the consequences are really the despair, youth despair. When we say we have this huge youth bulge dividend, what we have called it, but I've always said you can't call something a dividend if you're not investing in it. It is a liability to have youth that don't have jobs, to have youth that are dropping out of school, to have youth that are crossing the borders, illegal migration, to go and be economic refugees in neighboring countries, destabilizing even regional systems. If you look at health systems, social systems in the neighboring countries that have had to absorb those youths, those women who have gone to look for jobs out there. It's not a dividend. It's a liability and a cost, a social cost. It's a political cost. It's an economic cost if you look at it from that end, and that may have implications, because at the end of the day, something will have to give in. We will have to face these issues so that we correct what has gone wrong for decades and years. The trust deficit has already been spoken about, and it comes back to us building once again the consensus that we have to build as a people, and map that way forward, that speaks to dignity, that speaks to care, that speaks to fair taxation, that speaks to participation and representation, that speaks for Zimbabwe to a solidarity, regional solidarity, if I may put it that way as well. In terms of SADC itself, say how do we move from where we are to the next point without having to, in the end, count the heavy political and social costs that we are sitting on. I hope that we will be able to build on some alternatives that take into account some of these issues that have been shared by my fellow panelists, and I hope I've managed to just point to some of them in terms of really pushing for frameworks that center, that demarginalize the citizens who have been marginalized by the current political economy, if I may put it that way, that we have experienced and we have grown and experienced and seen from generation to generation. I'll stop here, Prof, and hand over the mic to you for a conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. Thank you very much. I think the three of you have adequately described the problem before us, the dire condition of the economy. But apart from Ostalos, who was very blunt and said politics is the solution, not surprising coming from a politician, but it's really the question here, and I'll start with Prosper. You've outlined the three major factors: the problem of stability, macroeconomic stability, or the lack of it, institutional decay, instead of strong institutions, and an infrastructure development lag of 10 years, requiring something like a financial input of 5 billion per annum for the next 10 years for us to catch up. Informalized economy. You said second highest. Second highest. Who's the highest? So we're 76%. Our manufacturing sector, GDP contribution to GDP 9% in 2023, from 14.8, 14.5 in 2018. It's all declined. It makes almost misplaced to talk about developing into a middle income country under these conditions. The question is, how do we reverse this decline? Prosper, you're very modest in your prescriptions for solutions. What would you say if you were put there as a Minister of Finance and Economic Planning, which is possible, huh, Prosper? What did you do?
Yeah. Well, I think my esteemed panelists have talked about the issue of politics. It's a major issue. Of course, I agree with that. It's related also to institutions. So Zimbabwe has a high political risk premium, and it's been caused by a number of factors, including the very toxic political environment. So that makes it even more expensive, say, for foreign investors to invest. But it also makes it even more difficult for Zimbabwean businesses to be able to attract capital on the international markets. But as long as that risk premium is there, and I'm happy that even at the TNF level, the partners, government, business, and employers, and employees, they actually agreed that the issue of politics, the issue of addressing this political risk premium. So there's a political risk premium that actually must be addressed in order to unlock a greater capital inflows into the country, greater foreign direct investment inflow, but also in order to even to promote local investments and local businesses. So it's not just necessarily about doing these things to please the foreign investors, but once you
what I mean, Prosper,
yeah.
How do we start? Why, in your opinion, how do we start to reverse this trend?
I think the issue of a social contract.
What should be done urgently? If we accept what Ostalo said, that politics is a solution, where do we start? People have been talking a variety of things, GNU, NTA, the need for intervention, which will cure this very sick political situation, a very sick economic situation. What do we do? What would you recommend?
The issue of a social contract, in my view, is very important. I think Brother Ostalos has mentioned that, or probably in Janet as well, in order to repair to address the trust and confidence deficit. So I think we we need to come together. I'm not sure whether that's going to be possible, and probably unite and try to achieve consensus in terms of addressing some of the challenges, these challenges that we're actually facing. But when you look at countries that have been in a similar situation in the past, countries like Bolivia, Latin American countries, Ecuador, at one point they experienced challenges, both economic and political challenges, but they're actually able to address the challenges through some form of a social contract, through some kind of a dialogue, but also coming together and uniting. But of course, that requires a lot of political will and commitment to be able to achieve that. But without a social contract, I think it would be difficult for people to trust each other and for the economy to probably sustainably grow. I think that's also what has come out of the TNF.
But Prosper, you are in touch with the political, with the officials of government in the Ministry of Finance, in the economic ministries, as part of your work. Do they share your observations? Are they conscious of this problem?
Yeah.
And if so, what do they say is to be done? Do they indicate? Because it seems to me that where the economy is on a free fall, whatever progress has almost been incidental, almost accidental. When you talk about macroeconomic stability, we've been talking about this problem since the 90s. The lack of fiscal discipline, we've been talking about this since the 90s. You know, institutional decay, we've seen it happening in front of us every day. You know, so, and when you talk about infrastructure development, I mean, whatever that's taken place has been on the back of massive corruption. You know, we were told about the tenders for even the Trabaras, whatever you call it, that that it was at a cost of almost more than double the actual cost. And so it goes on. It's now legion that every contract by government is highly inflated. So it has become an avenue for rent-seeking behavior, for corruption, blatant corruption, and for externalization of finances, as Ostalos has indicated. So just where do we start to get around it?
So when you converse with the technical officials, especially within the Ministry of Finance, even the central bank, we seem to find each other in terms of the challenges and what needs to be done. But obviously, there are political economic considerations, like I mentioned earlier on, that also then come into play. So sometimes even the reform agenda won't move fast enough. And then that then affects the economy. So
you're saying that the current state is incapable of reform, right? They failed. There's no capacity to reform, no?
Well, I think the capacity is there. I think what's needed is just to even when you look at what's coming out of the engagements with the IMF, they're pointing out that there is need to expedite the institutional reform agenda. I think that explains why I think the relationship between government and IMF, because the government was expecting that the IMF was going to come on board with the staff-funded program, but the IMF are insisting that there are certain reforms, for example, around capital controls, controlling the exchange rate, around institutions, the central bank itself as an institution. The IMF has raised some issues around the autonomy or lack of autonomy of the central bank, around the 25% surrender requirements, around issues to do with the IMTT. But when you converse with the minister, the minister. What is prioritizing, in my view, right now, the issues to do with debt repayment, and we've seen even during the first half of the year that significant amounts of resources actually went towards debt repayment, and obviously that affects other sectors. So But in terms of tax reforms, I don't think we are going to see
But
major changes.
you're aware basically that there's no one going to engage, not even the IMF itself.
Yeah.
Because
So the
going to
IMF
engage with Zimbabwe when there's no
yes.
political will, no capacity to reform. This has been the problem for the last 2 decades. So
Yeah.
maybe you are too much of a hardcore economist to be brave enough to say what Ostalos can say. Ostalos, tell us, when you say that politics is a solution, what would you do if you're a minister of finance, which is not impossible, by the way? Ostalos, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Ostalos? I think it's a problem with connectivity. Ostalos? 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 You are muted. You are muted. Please come in when you are ready to, anytime. In the meantime, I go to Janet. Janet, how do you begin this demarginalization?
Sorry, Prof, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I can hear you now. Yes, I was asking if
Yeah,
you're
you
a
can
minister of
go ahead with the question, Prof.
if you're a minister of finance and economic planning, which is not impossible, what would you do to start the much needed reforms of the economy? Where would you start?
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. That's a very important question. I think that the first thing is that the Ministry of Finance will have to focus firstly on obviously microeconomic stability. We have to first resolve the immediate problems facing our country, the currency issue. I think that the first thing we have to make sure is that in the interim, and I must underline, in the interim, the economy must dollarize in the interim, with the intention to resolve the question of our reserves, with the intention to resolve the question of production, because we cannot have our own currency if we are not producing, and also if we don't have sufficient gold reserves, and of course other macroeconomic fundamentals. So the first thing is the currency issue that ought to be sorted out, because that will then bring back confidence in the economy for an average Zimbabwean to be able to begin to trust the banks so that money begins to circulate, because that is a biggest issue on the roadmap to restore the broken down social contract. Secondly, this is the assumption that would have resolved the broad structural political problems facing our country, which is political. And on that, I want to highlight something that Doc has spoken about. And we'll be writing a paper on this with my other colleagues from UFS around the issue of building a consensus government. Our country at the present moment is divided by half. Our politics has become binary. It's either you are this side or you are this side.
Yes.
And the election results itself, even if you look at by their own standard, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission results confirms the same, even if they are manipulated. They confirm that half of the society is on the other side and half is on the other side. So what is needed at the present moment is a consensus government. What basically means is that we have to take a leaf from the current form of government in South Africa. And history has proven, if you look at Kenya when the economy was performing, and even Zimbabwe when economy was stabilized, it was between 2008 and 2013. So what that tells is that power in Africa, and Zimbabwe in particular, must be shared like a plate of SARS, which this is intending to restore this division in our country, this
You mean
binary interpretation.
You need a government of national unity. That's what you're talking about?
Yeah, it might be designed, it must be designed in its own character, but the essential characteristics must be that of a government of national unity or a
How would you
transitional
go about it?
mechanism.
Make a proposal.
I,
How
I
would you
think
go about it? How would you go
I
about
I
it?
think what is needed is the present moment. That is clear that ZANU-PF in its own cannot take this country forward. It is that clear. But also it is equally clear that the democratic movement, even if it assumes authority, would need elements of those that are within the establishment for the purpose of restoring the social contract that our country must be brought together. Because we are not different from Rwanda in the 90s or the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I think that the character of this transitional platform or government of nations can be designed by experts who deal with transitions. But what is clear for me from political terms is that what is needed is that there must be a clear sign of restoring a social contract, and you cannot restore it when the other side is not included. So the roadmap will be one. There must be a vehicle that must bring in political players. That's number one. Number two, it must bring the major stakeholders, that is the civic society, the academia, students, the few people within the working class, and of course the church. So these must then have a dialogue that must converse about the following issues. One, the reform agenda. How do we reform the state? How do we build institutions? Because the decay, the greatest decay that has happened in our country in the past 40 years is decay of state institutions. So this platform, whether it's a GNU, it's a transitional mechanism, as it were, its intention must be to build the capacity of state institutions. There is a consensus across the political divide with the greater majority of the people that the state in our country must lead development. There is a consensus among ourselves within the democratic opposition and the progressive voices within the regime that the state must lead development. It must play the arbiter between capital and ordinary people. So what it means is that to do that, it means we must build the capacity of the state by building institutions. So the mandate of this vehicle must be building strong state institutions. Secondly, to then deal with questions of reform, media reforms, political reforms, and securocratic reforms in their nature. And
So
then
you're
set a
saying
pathway.
basically you must begin at the level of politics. And in your view, a GNU or a National Transition Authority, have discussions in your group, in your forum, uh, ever considered these initiatives, GNU or NTA? What has been the
Precisely.
consensus? Pardon?
As we reflect as a democratic movement, as we reflect on the situation in our country, our conviction is that it is without a doubt that a transitional mechanism is the only way to go for our country. This is how we philosophize the exit point from this crisis. We think that a winner takes all will not work for the country because it will further divide the country. It will bring vindictive politics. Our country needs to heal. Our country needs to have a fresh breath, a fresh start. And therefore, in our view, the exit from this crisis must be centered around a conversation that brings in, not just because in our view, the reason why we differed with the Pollard platform is that it's centered on bringing in political elites together to to continue the extractive politics and the extractive order of our country. That is not what we believe in. We believe that the conversation must go beyond political elites and political parties and include professionals, include civic society, includes the church, because the social contract is not about two dominant political forces in the country. Despite that they play a
Yeah,
critical role, it
but
must
but
go
but you
beyond them.
but you belong to a very important constituency. I don't know where you are now.
Yeah.
Where are you now in terms of the political formations in the country? Where would you place yourself?
Um, at the present moment, I think that we remain with the progressive and the democratic alternative. I refer to this on the basis of the fact that What was started in September 1999 to form the Movement for Democratic Change still remains
Yeah.
the social base of that, the political establishment, despite that some of us are no longer in parliament and stuff like that. The social base and the major demographic political contingent remains with us
It's
as
the
led
same.
by
It remains
Advocate Nelson and Nelson Chamisa. And at the present moment, our process we're engaging on is a process of rebuilding and calibrating and consolidating that social base with the intention to bring in a new political vehicle, because it is no brainer, it is without a doubt that for us to contest political power, which is very clear in our method, that our method of changing government as a democratic party is through peaceful democratic means, which is an election. And to go into that process, we need a political vehicle. And therefore, the process that we're engaged in at the present moment is to ensure that we recalibrate and consolidate, but also make sure that we add into that base, given the changing demographics in our country, now focusing on young people, focusing on women, with the intention to then ensure that when we consolidate this, we're able to bring back the progressive forces into launching a political vehicle that will become a real harbinger of a democratically different Zimbabwe.
How far are you from forging that new formation?
Um, the
When are, when
process,
when
the
you when are
process
you likely to announce the new formation, Ostalos?
Um, at the present moment, it's difficult to give a precise date, but I would say that one of the emerging conversations at the present moment is the time factor. Every
Okay.
conversation we've had in the grassroots across the country is the question of the time factor. That whatever processes are being done at the present moment ought to be conscious about time, ought to be conscious about the role of the big events as the developments in the country, which are external to us. So while we are monitoring the external political developments, we have to make sure that our organization, our vehicle is ready to participate in whatever political process that will emerge as our country is, in our view, in a very serious break at the present moment.
A very important statement you have made, Ostalos. And we're glad that you are still very active and you still have a very important contribution to make, both in your individual capacity but also in concert with those that you're working with. Janet, how do we begin the demarginalization of the various forces that you mentioned? You spoke at length about the marginalization of almost every
Thank
sector of the society. How do we begin demarginalization? What is your response to Ostalos' suggestion? He was quite vague on the distinction or relationship between a GNU and an NTA. What is your uh, submission on the way forward?
you. Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. And thanks to colleagues. I one key factor probably that I do agree with colleagues is how polarizing our politics has been, and how exclusionary and marginalizing it has been. And I think in its current configuration, I think it would not bring the glad tidings that we're speaking about in terms of our economy. And I am just thinking in terms of Prof, how we move forward in terms of then stopping broadcasts and official narratives that things are working, or the economy is working, or even our politics is working, to co-authoring something that is different, and that is not alienating, that is not exclusionary, that is not polarizing, as we have seen with the Zimbabwean politics that we have experienced probably since independence, if we may put it that way. So I'm thinking of a framework that allows us to co-author a different narrative, a different story. And I want to go back. I think we've gone through different movements, to the democratic movement that Gift has spoken to, but I want to go back to a co-authoring platform that is actually liberatory, if I may use that word. I think we did not get the liberation. I think we have even become more captured in the mind by the current ruling elite and political elite. So I think a liberatory kind of movement that galvanizes the voice of the citizens, that centers it, the citizens not in their diversity, with their different needs, and have the different questions that we have to answer to as we co-author a different liberatory story going forward is very important. And we can center the famous phrase around the economy is stupid. And this will allow us to speak to the bread and butter issues. I think this will not alienate us. This will not polarize us to the point that we have, because we share the same experiences of the hardships that we have suffered and how we've been captured, be it the being a capture in our minds, the rewarding of not working, of corruption, and move on co-authoring a different story. But that centers the citizens, that galvanizes the citizens from the bread and butter issues perspective, while we then reconfigure new political narrative that can then deliver on the Zimbabwe that we wanted from the liberation struggle.
Okay.
I think that was a Zimbabwe for us all, not just for a few people. Prosperity for all, equality that we're talking about, which is really transformative in nature, and looks at all sectors, and we co-author how our agriculture should look like, how our mining sector should look like, how our social public infrastructure should look like, and begin to build on those fundamentals.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you very much. I think basically we have agreed, as I said earlier on, that the economy is in dire straits and it's not improving. It's actually digressing, getting worse. And whatever improvements there have been, or they've been almost incidental, that there's no reform framework for the economy. And above all, that there is need for a political framework through which a new political framework, which is capacitated, which has the capacity to reform the politics in the first instance, but also the economy. And we came close to it in the conversation with Ostalos Ziziba, and he has told us that on their side they are looking at a new formation, more or less based on the old MDC of 1999, and we have agreed clearly that currently the state has no capacity to do what is required. And inadvertently, when I pushed Chitambara, by asking him what do the officials in the economic ministry say, it's clear they're on the same page with him, but for the politics, the lack of political initiative on the part of those who govern our politics in our country. So, in conclusion, we are most grateful to the three of you for highlighting, especially for Chitambara, for outlining in great detail the status of the economy in Zimbabwe. We've been less explicit, although it's obvious, the political and social implications thereof, but more important, that it's still work in progress in terms of how we get out of our crisis, both political and economic. So I thank you. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Ostalos. You're not too late at all. Thank you for coming to this platform. And our chief economist, Prosper Chitambara, you have done us done us proud. Thank you very much. Until the next policy dialogue, a fortnight from now, goodbye.